Hello, and welcome to Law Talk. My name is John Celebrezzi, and I'm the co-founder of the Celebrezzi-Zangi Community Legal Education Project, as we call it, CZCLEP for short. Our organization provides continuing education about the judiciary and legislature to attorneys, judges, government officials, and the general public. As a career educator, I recognize early on how important legal matters are and how they impact our lives. I am the nephew of the late Anthony J. Celebrezzi, who was the popular 5-term mayor of Cleveland and a member of President Kennedy's cabinets. As a tribute to his lifetime commitment to the legal process, we dedicate this show.
In our third segment of our 10th anniversary Law Talk special, John hosts retired Judge James Kimbler, longtime Medina Municipal and Common Pleas judge. Judge Kimbler has appeared on Law Talk several times over the years. Judge Kimbler also served on the CZ faculty teaching evidence and other trial techniques. Let's join John and Judge Kimbler as they look at a few past episodes of Law Talk.
Judge Kimbler, welcome back.
Well, hello, John. How you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great. You know, it's been a while, but you're sort of a very special person in what this show is all about.
Okay, why is that?
Well, this is the 10th anniversary show of Law Talk, and we're putting together a kind of a special production. Actually, you will be segment 3 of that production. There'll be four segments total. But I have a question to ask you that falls right into this because, you know, it has been a decade. Time flies, as you know, when you're having fun. But do you know who was my very first guest 10 years ago?
I think I was, actually.
You were. You are absolutely right. So you were the appropriate person to invite today.
Well, thank you.
Very first Law Talk guest. Okay, well, while I'm testing your memory, Judge, do you remember what we talked about?
I think 10 years ago we were in the middle of the foreclosure crisis in Medina County in the state of Ohio, so I think we talked about the impact foreclosures were having on the Common Pleas Court docket.
That's exactly what we talked about, and we made an entire show out of it. Not only did I do a show with you, but I also did a show with Steve Bailey, who was a local attorney, and well, obviously he was defending a lot of people, and actually, all of the old Law Talk shows are on YouTube. You know,
really?
If you'd ever want to see them. Yeah,
wow.
There's quite a few of them.
Okay.
And I actually, you know, in anticipation of you coming today, I dug up that show myself because I wanted to take a look at it. So again, 10 years ago, you were on the Common Pleas bench in Medina. I guess I'd ask you this question, you know, in retrospect, looking back a decade. How bad was that problem?
It got up, the foreclosure docket got up to close to 50% of our total docket in the Medina County Court of Common Pleas. At that time, we were probably running maybe a little under, just around 1,000 cases a year, both civil and criminal. Probably about 600 of our cases a year, maybe a little bit more than that, were civil. So we were probably running between 250 and 300 foreclosures every year.
Sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, it was. Medina County is a wealthy county compared to other counties. In other counties, I think the foreclosure docket got up to over 50%, like in Summit and Cuyahoga. It was certainly a stressful time for both lending institutions and homeowners in the state of Ohio in Medina County. Okay.
Well, that's where we all started, Judge. We've talked about a lot of other things since then, but I guess before we leave it, I mean, it's retrospect now, looking back on it. It was it kept you and your staff extremely busy. It was a very troubled time, and that was right in a reasonably wealthy county, so it must have been worse in other places. What do you think caused it?
I think a combination of two things. First of all, banks were engaging in investing in exotic mortgage-backed securities called collateral exchange swaps or collateral default exchange swaps, and that caused. I don't think they really understood what they were doing, and that caused a lot of uncertainty in the banking system, which kind of froze up the transfer of money. The other thing was, I think that anytime you have some sort of boom, whether it be a real estate boom, stock boom, you have a bubble, so to speak. When the bubble deflates, it's going to be very financially troublesome to the people. And I think we had across the United States, we had a financial or a real estate bubble that burst in 2008, 2009. I remember going with my wife, Joyce Kimbler, down to Florida one year in about 2009, 2010. And we were in a relatively upscale area for tourism, and they just had foreclosure after foreclosure after foreclosure signs out on all these pretty expensive condominiums and houses. Wow. So it was, some areas were hit more than others. Medina County certainly had its share.
Sure. Well, Judge, we have the opportunity to look back. So let's take a look at our first law talk going back to 2008.
Now, on the one hand, foreclosure actions are very important to the banking system of the United States because people who loan money on real estate want to get that money paid back.
I see.
And how they do that is that they're encouraged to make loans because they know that if they secure the loan by a mortgage on the real estate, they can sell the real estate in order to satisfy the loan. And the flip side of that, so to speak, is that this allows people who probably could not afford to buy a house to buy a house. It also guarantees the bank that the people living in the house are going to have an interest in making sure the loan gets paid. So foreclosure actions are actions that are brought to sell the property to satisfy a debt. Now, we often think, or we usually think, about foreclosure actions being brought by banking institutions like savings and loan and mortgage companies. But the treasurer of the county can also bring a foreclosure action. And what the treasurer of the county can do is bring a foreclosure action to satisfy back taxes.
Well, Judge, after that show, I hosted a lot of other judges on Law Talk. You included. And your wife, Joyce, actually. Yeah. But I think maybe you were instrumental in at least telling me about what turned out to be my show with the most influential judge that I ever had on the show. Not that you weren't influential, Judge. Okay. Do you remember who that was?
Would it be Judge O'Connor, Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, or Associate Justice Yvette Brown?
That's what it was. That's right, Justice McGee Brown.
That's right.
She was a Supreme Court justice. She came to Medina. We did a very nice half-hour show. Actually, it was during the time where this facility wasn't built, but the original facility, which was in the old high school right down from us, was apparently demolished or not in operation. So we actually met downtown, and that was the venue for the show. But that was a show where we actually had an Ohio Supreme Court justice appear on our show. I guess for the benefit of my viewers, an Ohio Supreme Court justice. Okay, first of all, how many are there?
There's 7 Ohio Supreme Court justices at the present time, and I think there's been 7 since the adoption of the amendments to the 1851 Constitution, which were adopted in 1912.
Okay, but I mean, that word supreme sort of jumps out at you. So what makes, you said there's 7 of them.
Right.
So, all right, so there are only 7 of these positions for the entire state of Ohio?
Yes.
And these are elected officials?
Yes.
So it's a statewide vote?
Yes.
It's like the governor?
Yes.
All right, so it's not that easy to become a Supreme Court justice, obviously.
No.
This day and age. All right, so as far as the, well, I was going to use the word pecking order, but I think maybe I should use hierarchy. That would certainly be appropriate. But how are they supreme? I mean, why a Supreme Court justice apparently had more legal clout, or has more legal clout, than you did as a common pleas judge?
Yeah, that certainly is true. So probably since the Middle Ages, Originally, the British adopted the idea that there'd be trial courts and there would also be a chance to appeal an error of a trial court to a higher court. So at the present time, we have 3 layers of courts, so to speak, for want of a better term. We have the Ohio Supreme Court, which has statewide jurisdiction. We have, I believe, 12 courts of appeals, which have some of them have single county, but most of them have multi-county jurisdiction. So, for example, the 9th District, which we're in, has jurisdiction over Akron, Summit, Medina, and Wayne counties. And then you have trial courts. So trial courts can be the Court of Common Pleas, which every county has one, can be a juvenile court, can be a probate court, can be a municipal court, can be in some areas what is referred to as a county court, although those are very few. So the idea is that basically the trial courts hear trials. So when I was a common pleas court judge, I heard trials involving civil litigation such as malpractice suits, breach of contract, and felonies or any misdemeanors that were indicted by a grand jury. When I served in the Wadsworth Municipal Court, I heard misdemeanors only, preliminary hearings on felonies, and civil cases up to $15,000 in controversy. Okay. So basically the idea works like this. If the trial court makes a mistake, if the person believes a trial court has made a mistake, it can then go, that party can then go to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals then is the court that looks over to see whether or not the trial court made a mistake. Everybody gets one appeal of right in Ohio under our legal system. Everybody who's a litigant in a trial court gets one appeal of right to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals has to accept those cases from the trial courts. But overlooking those 12 appellate courts is the Ohio Supreme Court. And so if a party believes that, let's say a party believed, and this has happened to me 3 or 4 times, let's say they think I made an error, they go to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals affirms me, they then take it to the Ohio Supreme Court. The Ohio Supreme Court is what's called a certiorari court. It can or cannot take jurisdiction. The only exception is there's certain limited times when it must take jurisdiction. It also has to take jurisdiction on appeals of death penalty cases, which don't go through the Court of Appeals. They go directly from the trial courts to the Supreme Court. Okay. But basically what the Supreme Court is trying to do is to take cases that either involve challenges to the constitutionality of state statutes, cases that concern the construction of state statutes, how they're to be construed by courts, or possible cases of public importance, or cases where there's been a conflict between one Court of Appeals and another Court of Appeals. So, for example, if they had a case where the Court of Appeals in the 9th District said a statute is unconstitutional and under the Ohio Constitution, and then another Court of Appeals said, no, that statute is constitutional, then the Supreme Court would take in that case perhaps to resolve that conflict.
Well, I'll tell you what, Judge, let's take a look at that show I did with Ohio Supreme Court Justice McGee Brown. That was in 2012.
Well, as the Supreme Court, we're different from the appellate court because we're not an error correction court. So by that I mean for 96% of people in this state, the appeals court is as far as they go. We are a constitutional court, so we make decisions about constitutional issues and about issues that have broad general impact to the entire state.
I see.
So most people will stop at that appellate court level. We only accept about 5% of the cases that come in.
I see. That's interesting. So very, very small percentage, not error correction, but bigger issues, constitutional issues.
That's right.
Is it good law or is it bad law?
Right.
That sort of thing.
Does it comply with the Constitution? Yes.
Okay. Interesting. And Judge, by my count, going directly back to what you just explained to our viewers, I think I had a half dozen appellant judges on the show.
Which means you probably have had more direct conversations with appellate judges than most of the lawyers in the state of Ohio.
Wow. Well, I counted them, and actually, I think you personally know some of these judges. Judge Dickinson, Judge Theodosio.
Yes.
I understand now in your retirement years you have actually been sitting by assignments in other courts.
Yeah, I sit by assignment. I've been sitting by assignments by the Chief Justice and other courts, and one of the ones I go to a lot are the courts that sit in Summit County. Okay. So I've been in the Akron Muni Court, and I've also been in the Summit County Court of Common Pleas. So,
Judge Lynn Callahan,
right.
You've actually sat in her?
Yeah, I actually set her docket when she went to she was elected to the Court of Appeals in the 2016 election cycle. And so from from February 2nd of 2017 to June 30th of 2017, I was sitting her docket, so to speak, sitting her bench, because they didn't have, the governor had not yet appointed her successor. And so I tried, I was over there not every day, but I was probably over there 3 to 4 days every week.
I see. Okay, so you know Judge Callahan real well.
I know Judge Callahan's staff actually better than I know Judge Callahan.
Yeah.
I do know Judge Callahan, but I actually became pretty close to her staff too.
Well, she appeared on Law Talk, and of course she is a member of the 9th District, which you just explained, which I guess takes in
Medina, Summit, Lorain, and Wayne counties.
Okay, so in the scenario where either you, Judge Joyce Kimbler, Judge Collier, ruled on a case,
Sure.
and the litigants were not happy with it, or they as you said, possibly maybe there was a mistake or something, which is probably highly unlikely, but they would take their case to the 9th District Court of Appeals.
Right, they would have the right to file an appeal in the 9th District Court of Appeals. There's certain procedural things they have to do, like make sure they file the notice of appeal on time, make sure they comply with the briefing schedule. But there will be a hearing, assuming they do all that. The 9th District Court of Appeals will hear the case, and under Ohio law, they have to address every assignment of error that is made by the appellant.
I see.
And there can also be a cross appeal. For example, one litigant, let's say the plaintiff in a civil case, person bringing the lawsuit could file an appeal, and even though initially the defendant was not going to file an appeal, once the plaintiff files an appeal, the person defending could also file what's called a cross appeal. So you could have several assignments of error that the Court of Appeals had to address.
Okay.
It's a pretty research-intensive job.
Yeah. You know, we're going to take a look at that show here just in a second, but maybe a little bit as a side. I actually, well, as you know, I've been practicing Medina for a while. I actually did argue an appeal to Judge Belfance and two of the other justices some years ago. But I guess the point I want to make about it, the fact that I did, is not that significant. But it was in your courtroom.
That's right. They sit in Medina County once a month, and they sit in Wayne County once a month. They sit in Lorain County twice a month, and they sit the rest of the time, I think they're in Akron, Summit County.
So they're like a circuit court.
Yeah, and the great thing about being in that courtroom, the great thing about being the judge in courtroom number 2 in Medina County, where I was located, is that because the Court of Appeals comes there, we have an extra wide bench. Yeah. So we have a pretty big bench, and so you can actually, that comes in handy sometimes because you want to talk to the attorneys outside the presence of the jury, or at least not have the jury hear you. With that big bench, you can just scoot down to the one side and the jury can't hear you.
Oh, how about that? Okay. Well, Judge, let's take a look at Judge Callahan's
we're
show.
strictly looking at the legal and constitutional issues, so it's not the retrial.
Now, when I've seen your colleagues, and I'm sure you'll be there as well in Judge Kimbler's courtroom, there's 3 of you up there.
Correct.
Okay, so each of you, in at least the oral argument part of it, the lawyers are approaching you, both sides, and they have an appropriate amount of time to, well, I kind of hate to say make their case, but they are sort of making their case. They're bringing whatever issues that they feel was an error, and okay, but you got to listen to it. Your 2 colleagues do, but do we get a meeting of the minds here someplace?
Usually, often. Now, and keep in mind, they've already briefed the issues, so before we listen to them, we've had a chance to read their briefs and reply briefs, and so we've had a chance to maybe not look at the record yet, but look at the legal issues and even maybe a little advance on some research. And that's probably the biggest change from municipal and common pleas court, where I acted solo.
Sure,
and
sure.
now I act with two others at all times. And the good news is you get to bounce ideas off someone else and glean from their wisdom and their experience. And but if we don't agree, you certainly have the option of writing a dissenting opinion or even a concurring opinion. But
well, Judge, not to diminish the importance of any Ohio court, but there seems to be, my notes, Your Honor, said pecking order, but I think I'm going to say hierarchy now. I think that was an excellent suggestion you gave me. But there is a hierarchy. What court follows the Court of Appeals on the hierarchy?
Supreme Court of Ohio.
No, the Supreme Court of Ohio is
Oh, you
the
mean,
highest.
are you going down?
We start with the Supreme Court.
Right.
That's the top.
And then the Court of Appeals
Court
are
of
next.
Appeals, which you've explained.
And then the
both.
trial courts.
Okay, so now the trial court.
In Medina County, that would be the Wadsworth and Medina Municipal Courts, the Medina County Court of Common Pleas, the Medina County Domestic Relations Court, the Probate Court of Medina County, and the Juvenile Court of Medina County.
Okay, so on a hierarchy, common pleas or municipal, which one's higher?
Well, that's not how I think I would look at it, because they're all equal courts in the sense that they all have defined jurisdiction. So I would not think of it as a hierarchy. What I would think of it as that the municipal court has one job to do, the Court of Common Pleas has another job to do, just like the probate and juvenile court judges have jobs to do. So I don't really think of it as a hierarchy. I think of it more as different functions. Probably, in some respects, the common pleas judges have more power in some respects than a municipal court judge, because they have the power to issue injunctions, to grant what is called equitable relief, and those are very limited for the municipal courts. On the other hand, municipal courts hear all misdemeanors committed in their jurisdiction that get filed with them, whereas a court of common pleas can only hear a misdemeanor if the grand jury indicts it. For that matter, we can only hear a criminal case in the court of common pleas if the grand jury indicts it.
But the crimes themselves, Judge, I mean, you did both, actually.
Sure.
But the maximum penalty for a misdemeanor in the state of Ohio, I think, is 180 days in jail and a $1,000 fine.
Well, that's true for most cases, but there are some DWIs you can go to jail for 1 year.
But in your tenure as a common pleas judge in courtroom number 2, I mean, I personally witnessed you preside over death penalty cases.
I had one death penalty case.
Matter of fact, I actually had we did a show with Russ Bazzelli on that. So, I mean, I guess I'm getting your meaning here. One's not more important than the other, but sentencing somebody to death versus 180 days, that seems to be a significant difference.
Well, I never thought of it quite that way. I've never thought of the difference in the sentencing being that determinative. I can see why you say that. I guess I would put it this way, that the penalties that you can impose from a court of common pleas are significantly higher than the penalties you can put on a person from a municipal court. On the other hand, anytime you incarcerate somebody, no matter for how long a period of time that is, the effect on that person can be traumatic. The effect on their job, the effect on their family, the effect on themselves, the effect on their psyche. And so when I sat on the municipal court bench, I believe I was cognizant of that effect when I incarcerate people. And I believe that when I sat on the Court of Common Pleas, I was certainly cognizant of that.
Okay. Well, I mean, you make a very good point, though. I mean, I kind of came to the conclusion, well, if you gave the death penalty versus 6 months in jail, but yeah, this is the issue of people's liberty we're talking about here. I guess shifting gears, I mean, in your long tenure as a judge here in Medina County, it all started, as I recollect, around the mid 80s.
Yeah, I was appointed by,
You were appointed by the governor, right?
Right.
And who was the governor?
The governor was Richard Celeste, and what happened was on December 31st, 1985, my predecessor, Judge David Hensel, who actually is the deceased father of a Court of Appeals judge, Jennifer Hensel.
Yeah, she was on the show.
Right. He died, and under Ohio Constitution, the governor appoints until an election can take place the successor for all judges that are, whether it be a Supreme Court justice, a Court of Appeals judge, or any trial court judge. The governor appoints a person to be that to fill that position until such time as there's an election for that position.
So he appointed you.
Right.
You went to the municipal bench.
Right.
But at some point in time, you had to stand re-election.
Right. I ran. So I was appointed on February of 1986, and I was a candidate in the November of 1987 election, and I was elected then for 6 years. And I stood election again in 1993, but I was unopposed. And then I decided to run before my term was out. I ran in 96 for the Court of Common Pleas and was successful. Because that now created a vacancy, then the governor at that time, who's a different governor, of course, appointed Judge Steve McElvain to fill my position.
Oh, okay. And
so that's how he became a judge.
And
actually, I read a statistic one time that close to 3/4 of all judges in the state of Ohio start their career as a gubernatorial appointment.
I see. Okay. Well, it's interesting. Now, in your explanation here, you've talked about sentencing people. That's what judges do.
Sure.
Okay, and I sort of brought up, well, sentencing somebody to death versus misdemeanor is different.
Sure.
But maybe I get your meaning here. I'm sure my viewers do too. But at one time, and actually, I looked it up. It was 2009. I had you back after, I had you back a couple times over the years, but we spent an entire show talking about sentencing. Now, I don't know if you remember that show.
I had forgotten that.
Well, we did. And at this point in time, let's take a look at that show.
That a legislative body, whether it be the General Assembly of the State of Ohio with regard to crimes that are acts that are made crimes by state statutes, or a municipal government or a village council when they pass an ordinance, all crimes are statutory, which means that a legislative body has enacted a law or a ordinance or a statute that makes certain activity a crime. So
I see.
So when I say all crimes are statutory, that means that somewhere when a person's charged with a crime, whether it's a felony,
contribution. You've been a good sport about being on Law Talk on numerous occasions. We talked about a lot of relevant issues, I think, as we've indicated today, sentencing. I understand in your retirement years you're even doing some private judging.
I am, yeah. In fact, I have a case scheduled to be, I'm going to be a private judge in a couple cases. One, I think, the week after next, and the week after that. So.
And I understand you're doing a little mediation work.
I am doing some mediation work. It is interesting to be a mediator because when I'm a mediator, I'm not the one making any decisions.
Yeah.
And that's actually probably been good for me from a ego standpoint.
Well, once again, Judge, speaking for all of us, we certainly thank you for your contribution to Law Talk, and it's great to have you.
Well, thank you, John, for hosting Law Talk for the last 10 years. This has been an opportunity that you've taken both as a former educator and as a lawyer to educate the public about the law, and as a person who has to deal with the public and would sometimes want them to have more information about what we do. Your show has been invaluable, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Judge.
In this final segment of the 10th year anniversary Law Talk special, John reminisces about his uncle Anthony Celebrezzi, the famous 5-term mayor of Cleveland and member of President John F. Kennedy's cabinet. Mayor Celebrezzi's lifelong commitment to law earned him the privilege of having the federal building in Cleveland named in his honor. Let's join John now.
Welcome to our final segment of our 2-hour 10th anniversary show. As the host of Law Talk, I've had the honor of interviewing numerous judges, attorneys and others right here in the WCTV studio in Wadsworth, Ohio. It is because of the dedicated staff here at WCTV that Law Talk is possible. We affectionately refer to the staff as the 3 J's, John, and Joanna. I take this opportunity right now to thank these 3 dedicated professionals who have always been here to support, assist, and recognize CZ. Without them, this show would not have been possible. So please, John, and Joanna, please accept my heartfelt thanks on the part of the Celebrezzi Zangi Community Legal Education Project, which you've been so dedicated through over the last 10 years as we put together numerous Law Talk episodes. Today's a little different day. It seems strange for me to be here talking to my viewers without a guest, but it was just appropriate for me to do this part on my own as we're reaching the finale of our 10th year anniversary. Throughout the other segments, we've shown viewers small portions of Law Talk episodes, and if you've got this far in watching the show, you know that, featuring many of my guests. I mean, but now, as I said, we've reached the finale. I think it's appropriate to spend some time talking about the man who inspired the show, and he happens to be my uncle, my late uncle, Anthony J. Celebrezzi. We affectionately refer to him as Uncle Tony. After all the shows that we've done and tributes that we've done to him, my CZ staff, probably the WCTV staff, everybody knows who I'm talking about when I talk about my Uncle Tony. But I guess today I should sort of introduce him to you maybe in a little more detail. My Uncle Tony was an outstanding public servant, and coming from a very humble beginning, along with his 9 siblings, one of them being my father. My uncle was raised by my grandparents, Rocco and Dorothy Celebrezzi. They were proud Italian immigrants who came here about the beginning of the 1900s looking for a better place to raise their children, like many, many people did. Uncle Tony is a classic example of the American success story. He worked as a paper boy, a custodian, a factory worker, a truck driver, a railroad laborer, and a boxer. But what makes it somewhat significant, he did all these things on his way to a position as a cabinet member for John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States. Uncle Tony was, in fact, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare during the early 60s, and on his watch, a lot of landmark legislation, including Medicare and civil rights laws, were passed. So I always take this opportunity to share what I consider one of my favorite props, if you will. This is a picture. It was taken in July, I think, of 1962. It's on the White House lawn. And I think you can see there's President Kennedy. And on the other side of the picture is my uncle. And that's pretty much my family there, as they all celebrate him being sworn in as the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, you might not be able to read the inscription on it, but I'm gonna go ahead and read it. It kind of means a lot to me. It says, "To John Celebrezzi, with best wishes," but then he writes, "Uncle Anthony J. Celebrezzi." So I guess, as I've said on numerous occasions, a lot of Italian guys have an Uncle Tony, but mine's pretty special. Uncle Tony's legacy lives today. Those of us who have taken care of loved ones, and age 70 myself, I am now eligible, know that Medicare has been a pretty significant piece of legislation affecting all of our lives, even though it's many, many years since Uncle Tony somewhat mentored this through Congress, along with Lyndon Johnson and President Kennedy. A story that he often told me, which I'll repeat for you today. He said he was having a discussion with President Kennedy, President John Kennedy, who was his boss. I mean, he's the man who made, well, as you can see from that picture, selected him to be in his cabinet. And the conversation was taking place in November of 1963, and I guess the last thing that the president said to my uncle, he says, "Tony, I'll talk to you when I get back from Dallas." But I guess we all know President Kennedy never made it back from Dallas. It's kind of special to have a member of your family who could tell you stories like this that really happened, and for me it was particularly special. I spent a good deal of my life as a school teacher. I taught history and social studies. Later on went on to be an attorney, and that's pretty much what Law Talk is all about. But all of this was inspired by my uncle Tony, and he really set a good example for all of us. Anyway, taking a look at how the show sort of dovetails into Uncle Tony's long career. Uncle Tony was a graduate of Ohio Northern University School of Law, and we're talking about, I believe he graduated in 1936. He's considered, to this day, one of Ohio Northern's probably most prominent graduates. And to honor him, every year, they have a moot court competition, and it's entitled Anthony J. Celebrezzi Appellant Advocacy Competition. And interestingly enough, if you followed our show for the last several years, I always attend this competition because I'm a member of the Celebrezzi family. And then I typically invite the winner of the competition to be here on Law Talk. So we've had law students on the show, and I mean, the last one I had was this summer, and the young lady's name was Kelly Rattata, and we did an entire show on that. However, I sort of looked back. Kelly was a great show, by the way. I sort of looked back at some other shows that we've done in past years, and I basically found this to be true. Almost all of the topics that these law students argued during the moot court competition at Ohio Northern were real issues, and they were before the Ohio Supreme Court. So interestingly enough, I had the winner of the competition here at the studio here in Wadsworth, Ohio, usually in the summer, following when they actually argued the competition was in the spring. So I guess the point of all this, they argued a real case that was decided later in the summer by the United States Supreme Court. And most of the issues were controversial and significant. The one that I mentioned Kelly argued this summer had to do with the baker refusing to bake the cake for a gay couple. Interestingly enough, Kelly won the competition, but she actually won it arguing the opposite way than how the Ohio Supreme Court ruled on it. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about another show. Several years ago, well, we're going back to 2010, so it's been a few years ago. I had a young, then second-year law student, Chase Carter, on the show, and Chase again was a winner of the Celebrezzi moot court competition. His topic, the topic that he argued, had to do with the Second Amendment right to bear arms, which, as I think we all know, is still an ongoing conversation. As a second-year student, and almost like every other Celebrezzi moot court winner that's appeared on Law Talk, and I was there, I mean, I saw it, he probably put forward as good an argument as any seasoned attorney I've ever seen, and I've been around courtrooms for a lot of years. So at this point in time, let's take a look at the show with Chase Carter on the topic of Second Amendment right to bear arms. The state of Montana could probably let you do about anything you want with a gun, not to be stereotypical, but it's kind of a rural state and whatnot. In the state of Illinois, which had to do something with your case, Chicago, could have really, really constrictive gun control.
Right. which is basically the heart of the issue in that case. The city had passed an ordinance that required all firearms to be registered. Anybody that owned a firearm had to carry a permit issued by the city. The problem became when they went to license firearms, the restrictions were extremely tight. Handguns could not be registered at all. There was no way to possess legally a handgun within the municipality of Chicago. You also had to possess...
Aside from law students appearing on Law Talk, we've also had the opportunity to have high school students on, at least one that stands out in my mind. And being an old high school principal myself, this has been kind of an area that's been sort of near and dear to me. We met with the winners of some of Medina County's high school moot court competition, moot court competitors, and this is going back to about I think it was 2012. It was a pretty interesting show, but a little bit about the high school moot court competition. It's sponsored by the State Bar Association, the Ohio Attorney General's Office, and the Ohio Supreme Court. The kids, and again, this isn't anything new. I mean, this thing has been ongoing since the early 80s. Function somewhat like a debate team. However, they usually have a lawyer. In our case, it was a local attorney, Jim Amodio, serve as an advisor. They put a lot of work into these, and then the competition starts, and eventually it goes on for several months, but the top contenders get to argue their case before the Ohio Supreme Court. And you gotta remember, these are high school kids, they're juniors and seniors. Our representative was a fine young man by the name of Brad Shook, and he was a student at Buckeye High School. Brad, along with Attorney James Amodio, appeared on the show. At this point in time, let's take a look at that show.
On a particular weekend in Glen, Ohio, and that weekend there were 4 thefts of prescription drugs.
Practices, if they needed me to fill a spot, I'd be a witness as well. But my primary thing was a defense attorney.
I see. And is it true when you guys prepare for this, Brad, you have to be able to do it on both sides?
Yes.
In my practice, I think about that every now and then, what it would be like to have to shift gears.
It's kind of funny because you're going to say one thing in the morning, and then in the afternoon you're going to turn around and say the complete opposite thing.
Sure. The Ohio High School mock trial program, as I mentioned earlier, has been around since the 1980s. It's still going strong. I mean, it's every year. Whenever I could possibly involve myself, like all other lawyers in the state, we have the opportunity to volunteer our time to judge the kids as they work through the competition. Usually the competitions will start in the local courtroom, which that's where as you can see from the little clip we just showed you, started in Judge Kimbler's courtroom. However, as they progress to the regionals, and then they eventually wind up down at the state, and then the last competition is in Columbus. Quite an honor for the students to win this. Interestingly enough, certainly this whole endeavor that we've done is all about education, legal education. So I see it as a perfect fit to have the students have been on the show and kind of showed their stuff here, so what they can do. And I'm sure, my uncle, as I remember him, would certainly be a strong supporter of this. But interestingly enough, he actually touched this program too, and a lot of people don't know this, but his son, Anthony J. Celebrezzi Jr., that would be my first cousin, he was the Attorney General of the state of Ohio from the period between, I believe, 1982 and 1990. During that time is when the high school mock trial program got going, and Tony was actually a sponsor of it. So proud to give him some recognition, and he's since passed away, but it'd be nice for him to know that 30 years later his efforts are still going strong, doing something that is strongly encouraging legal education in our high schools. And this is a fine, fine program, and kudos to everybody who made it possible and continues to make it possible. As we move on, I think there might be one person that could best relay to you, my viewers, his relationship with Anthony J. Celebrezzi, my Uncle Tony. And this man is retired attorney Richard Marco. He's the founder of Marco & Marco, which is still doing business today at 52 Public Square in Medina. But Dick Marco, actually not only was befriended by my uncle, but actually even more so, Uncle Tony turned out to be somewhat of a mentor to him. He has a wealth of knowledge about my uncle. He was there, and again, back to the picture, there he is standing, there he is standing right next to the President of the United States when my uncle was inaugurated as the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Dick was kind enough to sit down with a member of our board of directors, CZ board of directors, Adrian Casper, at the law offices of Marco & Marco, the very law office that he founded, and talked to us about Uncle Tony and his, well, how his life was impacted by my uncle and his commitment to legal education. Dick is probably into his 80s now, and has a pretty good recollection of the 1950s when I think he first became a lawyer, and well, obviously he was mentored along by my uncle. So at this point in time, let's take a look at least a portion of that interview.
Shoes. He would walk the railroad tracks where his father worked as a laborer and pick up pieces of coal, bring them home to be used in the winter. He worked very hard all of his life. In fact, he worked his way through college. He went to Penn State, Penn College, and then John Carroll University, all the time working as a truck driver or a laborer on the railroad tracks. He even did a little boxing. When he graduated from Carroll, he went to Ohio Northern University Law School. When he graduated from there, he returned to Cleveland and started practicing law. It was in about 1938.
And at that time, he went into private practice?
He went into private practice and got married. As a matter of fact, he married my dad's sister, Anne. And that's how he came to be my uncle.
I see.
She was a school teacher, and he often said that if I had her brains, think how far I could have gone.
Sounds like he had a lot of respect for her.
He did. He loved her, and they stayed together until his death. They were together about 67 years.
How did he begin his career in public service?
Well, he was always interested in public service, as were other members of his family. He started, as I said, he started practicing in 1938. In 1951, he decided to run for the state legislature and was elected easily. Stayed there for a couple of years, but resigned when then Governor Lauschie and Louis Seltzer and several other prominent citizens suggested that he run for mayor of Cleveland, which he did, and was easily elected.
I see. And did he serve one term as mayor of Cleveland?
He actually served 4 terms and was elected to a 5th, which was unprecedented at the time, and he won by more than 72% of the votes. It was at that time that President Kennedy took a particular interest in him, offered him a lifetime job as a federal judge, but Uncle Tony refused that at the time because he was in the process of running for his 5th term. About 2 years later, President Kennedy offered him a position as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, which Uncle Tony accepted.
I see, and I have a photograph right here, which I see that you are in this photograph right here, and Uncle Tony is right here, along with President Kennedy. What can you tell me about this day?
Well, this was his inauguration as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. President Kennedy offered a family photo, and this photo was the one that was taken. I was standing, this was in the Rose Garden, incidentally. I was standing back, and Kennedy tried to get me to come up. He waved at me, and I started moving forward, and two men kept standing in front of me. Kennedy laughed and grabbed a hold of me and just pulled me up. Later told me that they were Secret Service agents assigned to protect him.
Oh my God.
But it was an interesting time, and Uncle Tony did a great job as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. In fact, he was the last one after he resigned. The department was broken up into two separate divisions. While he was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, he did some notable jobs that I'm sure you're familiar with.
Such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one, I believe.
I knew you were going to ask me about it, so I brought a note along so that I wasn't. The two notable acts that are attributed to Secretary Celebrezzi are the Social Security Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was adopted pretty much while Kennedy was still president, before he was shot. And it provided for that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools and employment and the public. This act has been is still currently being worked on, particularly in the area of women's rights. The other act that it was notable for was the Social Security Act of 1965. This was primarily under President Johnson. The original Social Security Act, passed in 1925, did not provide for medical assistance for the elderly and for the ill. The Social Security Act of 65 provided for that medical assistance, and is known as Medicare and Medicaid, and is currently still very active.
Yes, definitely. When he was finished with his role as the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, did he retire at that time? Did he continue his work in Washington?
No, he did not retire. As a matter of fact, when he did go to resign, he talked. There were two interesting things going on. Before he resigned, President Johnson was going to run for re-election and asked Uncle Tony if he would like to serve as his running mate. Uncle Tony informed him that, well, you have to change the Constitution in order to accomplish that. I wasn't born in the United States.
Really?
He was not aware that he hadn't been born in the United States until he went to enlist in the Navy during World War II. It's when he first learned that he was actually born in Anzi, Italy, and came to the United States when he was 2 years old.
I see.
President Johnson thought that was hilarious. But then the other factor when he went to resign was he told President Johnson that he could no longer afford to live in Washington on the $25,000 a year salary that he was receiving at that time. He was afraid he was going to lose his house. President Johnson replied, and I wrote that down too because I thought it was an interesting quote. "You are too honest for Washington. You're the first cabinet secretary to go broke while working for the White House." So he resigned. Johnson accepted his resignation, but 2 days later, he appointed him to a lifetime position as federal judge in the Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati.
Is that an important position?
A very important position. It was a lifetime job. He wrote a number of opinions that were that are still of interest today. That was the Beasley versus the United States was one of the opinions that provided a standard for effective assistance of counsel, and remains the standard today. None of the opinions that he authored have ever been overturned by the Supreme Court.
Really?
He had a fantastic record.
Did you spend much time with him toward the end of his life?
Oh yes, he retired from the court, but he remained as a senior judge until his death, as a matter of fact. I spent a lot of time with him, and on the day before he died, I was visiting him in the hospital, and with several other people. He was in a coma. He was not responsive to anybody. When it was time to leave, everyone said goodbye to him, that they would see him again, and I walked up to him and said, "I'll see you," and I was going to say, "I'll see you tomorrow," but I couldn't, so I said, I can't see you tomorrow, I have to be in court." And he opened his eyes and said, "Be prepared."
He was always an attorney.
Well, yes, he was.
Well, I'd like to thank you for speaking with us today and talking about Uncle Tony, and we really appreciate you being here, and it's been our pleasure.
Thank you for having me, and I always like to think about him.
Thank you, Mr. Marco.
Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye. Speaking for all of us at the Celebrezzi-Zangi Community Legal Education Project, I certainly would like to say thank you for your loyal viewership as far as showing an interest in legal education. It's frankly been my pleasure and a humbling pleasure to be the host of Law Talk for these 10 years. And I wish you all the best. Hopefully, as you watch the show, you learn some things about how our legal system works, which still remains to be the envy of the world. So on that, I will bid you farewell.
Comments made by John's guest on Law Talk are solely those of his guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of Celebrezzi-Zangi Community Legal Education Project. To view this show and others, go to www.CZCLEP.org. In the Wadsworth area, a complete listing of dates and times of this broadcast, tune in to WCTV Channel 15 or log on to wadsworthcity.com and follow the links to WCTV. At CZCLEP, we're devoted to the education of today's legal issues. Fueled by the public's keen interest in our legal system and current events, CZCLEP is dedicated to the educational venues aimed at enhancing the understanding by all citizens, regardless of age, education, occupation, or wealth. A function of the Celebrezzi-Zangi Community Legal Education Project.